There was a time when anyone would tremble upon hearing the name John D. Rockefeller. Not only was he the world's first billionaire, he's one of the richest people in history. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most dominant monopoly in the world by brutally crushing competitors, taking control of multiple industries, bribing the government into submission, and treating business as if it was war. Because of his ruthless business practices and secretive deals, Rockefeller made many enemies. His career is filled with bitter rivalries like with Andrew Carnegie, and even ferocious battles against U.S. presidents. But, before he was the titan of the oil industry, Rockefeller was at the very bottom of society. His story is one of only a handful of cases where someone manages to rise from the depths of poverty, to the absolute peak of wealth and power. Rockefeller's story is at times inspiring, and at times, chilling. Tonight, as the world settles into shadow, let us walk back through the fog of a century, into the life of a man who built an empire so complete, so ruthless, that the government itself had to break it apart. This is not a story of luck. This is a story of vision, calculation, and a hunger that never slept. Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day slip away. And let us begin where all great empires begin, in the quiet desperation of a boy who refused to stay poor. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap on subscribe, a soft press of the bell, and these stories will find you again, night after night, as you drift toward rest. No rush. Just a quiet invitation. Stay a while. There are childhoods that teach you to dream, and then there are childhoods that teach you to survive. John Davison Rockefeller's belonged to the second kind. He was born on July 8, 1839, in a wooden farmhouse in Richford, New York, a place so small it barely earned a dot on the map. The house sat at the edge of fields that stretched toward forests, and beyond those forests, a world that felt impossibly distant. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a man of tall tales and taller absences. He called himself a traveling salesman, a trader of medicine and miracle cures, a man who could charm a room and vanish before dawn. Some called him Big Bill. Others called him a con man. The truth, as it often does, lived somewhere in the space between. John's mother, Eliza, was the opposite in every way. Where William was loud, she was quiet. Where he was reckless, she was steady. She held the family together with Bible verses and discipline, teaching her children that work was prayer and idleness was sin. She believed deeply in God, in duty, in the quiet dignity of a life lived without shortcuts. And when William disappeared for weeks, sometimes months, leaving the family without money or answers, it was Eliza who kept the lights burning. She did not complain. She did not curse his name. She simply worked, prayed, and taught her children that survival was a form of faith. John was the second child, a quiet boy with sharp blue eyes and a mind that never stopped counting. While his older sister helped with chores and his younger siblings played in the dirt, John sat with his mother's account books, tracing the numbers with his finger, learning the language of pennies and debts. He saw how a single dollar could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. He watched his mother stretch every coin until it screamed, and he learned that money was not just paper and metal, it was power. It was control. It was the only thing that kept the wolves from the door. By the time he was 7, he was raising turkeys to sell to neighbors. By 10, he was lending small amounts of money to local farmers and charging interest. It was not greed that drove him, not at first. It was something colder, something more essential. It was the realization that the world did not care whether you were good or kind or devout. The world cared whether you could pay your debts. And John D. Rockefeller decided, even as a boy, that he would never be the one left waiting for money that would not come. His father's absences taught him another lesson, one that would shape his entire life. You could not trust charm. You could not trust promises. You could only trust what was written down, what was counted, what was real. William would return from his travels with pockets full of cash and stories full of wonder, and for a few days, the house would feel alive again. But then he would leave, and the silence would return, heavier than before. John learned not to celebrate his father's arrivals or mourn his departures. He learned to expect nothing and prepare for everything. It was a hard education, but it was complete. When John was 14, the family moved to a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio. It was a city on the edge of transformation, a place where railroads were beginning to carve new paths and factories were rising along the rivers. Eliza enrolled John in a high school, but he lasted only a few months before restlessness overtook him. He was not interested in Latin or philosophy or the long, winding conversations of boys who had time to waste. He wanted to work. He wanted to earn. And so, at 16, he enrolled in a 3-month business course at Folsom's Commercial College, where he learned bookkeeping, penmanship, and the mechanics of banking. He absorbed it all with the intensity of a monk studying scripture. And when he graduated, he set out into the city with a single goal: to find a job that would let him prove what he already knew. That he could count better, work harder, and think further ahead than anyone else in the room. He walked the streets of Cleveland for 6 weeks, knocking on doors, asking for work. He was turned away again and again. Too young. Too inexperienced. Too serious. But he did not stop. He kept a list of every company he visited, and when he reached the end of the list, he started over. On September 26, 1855, a date he would later call the most important of his life, he walked into the office of Hewitt & Tuttle, a small commission merchant firm, and asked to see the owner. Isaac Hewitt looked at the thin, serious boy in front of him and saw something that others had missed. Not charm. Not ambition. But something quieter and more dangerous. Precision. He hired John as an assistant bookkeeper. The pay was modest, the work tedious, but John treated it like a cathedral. He arrived early and stayed late. He checked every figure twice, then checked it again. He found errors that no one else had noticed and corrected them without fanfare. He never asked for praise. He simply worked, and the work spoke for itself. Within months, he was handling the firm's most important accounts. Within a year, he was indispensable. And in the quiet hours after everyone else had gone home, he would sit at his desk, staring at the ledgers, and dream of something larger. Something that would make these numbers look like dust. By the time John turned 20, he had saved enough money to make a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. He had learned everything Hewitt and Tuttle could teach him. He had mastered the rhythm of commerce, the language of contracts, the silent dance of profit and loss. But he was still working for someone else, still counting another man's money. And deep in his chest, beneath the layers of discipline and restraint, something burned. Not ambition in the ordinary sense. Not a hunger for fame or recognition. But a need, almost spiritual in its intensity, to build something that belonged to him alone. In 1859, he formed a partnership with a man named Maurice Clark, another young merchant with a steady reputation. Together, they opened a commission business dealing in grain, hay, meats, and whatever else the growing city of Cleveland demanded. They called it Clark and Rockefeller, and from the very first day, John ran it like a military campaign. He negotiated every deal personally, inspected every shipment, tracked every penny that moved through the books. He worked 16-hour days and never complained. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not waste time on idle conversation or the social rituals that other young men found so essential. His life was the business, and the business was his life. The partnership thrived. Within a year, they were handling thousands of dollars in transactions, serving farmers, wholesalers, and the railroads that were stitching the nation together. But John was already looking beyond grain and hay. He was watching something else, something that was beginning to transform the entire landscape of American industry. Oil. Black, thick, and smelling of sulfur, it bubbled up from the ground in western Pennsylvania, where a man named Edwin Drake had drilled the first successful oil well in 1859. At first, people did not know what to do with it. Some used it for medicine. Some burned it for light. But soon, the world realized that this strange liquid could replace whale oil, could light homes and streets, could power machines in ways that nothing else could. And suddenly, everyone wanted it. The problem was chaos. Thousands of men rushed to the oil fields, drilling wherever they pleased, flooding the market one month and drying it up the next. Prices swung wildly. Fortunes were made on Monday and lost by Friday. It was a gambler's paradise and a businessman's nightmare. Most people saw madness. John D. Rockefeller saw opportunity. Not in drilling, that was too unpredictable, too dependent on luck. But in refining. In turning raw crude oil into kerosene, the clean-burning fuel that the world was beginning to crave. That was where the real money lived. Not in the ground. But in the machine that processed what came out of it. In 1863, John convinced Maurice Clark to invest in a small oil refinery in Cleveland. It was a modest operation, one of many springing up across the region, but John approached it with the same ruthless efficiency he had brought to everything else. He studied every stage of the refining process, eliminated waste, improved equipment, and drove costs down to levels that other refineries could not match. He did not care about being the biggest. He cared about being the most efficient. And efficiency, he understood, was a form of violence. It crushed competitors not with noise, but with silence. By simply being better, cheaper, faster, you could make other men obsolete without ever raising your voice. But Maurice Clark did not share his vision. Clark was content with steady profits, modest growth, the comfortable rhythm of success. John wanted more. He wanted total control. And in 1865, the two men came to a crossroads. They decided to settle the matter with an auction. Whoever bid the highest would buy out the other. The auction took place in a small office, just the two of them and a notary. The bids climbed slowly at first. $500. $1,000. $2,000. Maurice hesitated as the numbers rose. But John never blinked. He kept bidding, his voice calm, his hands steady, until Maurice finally shook his head and stopped. The final bid was $72,500, a fortune in 1865. John had won. And as he signed the papers, he felt something settle inside him, something that had been restless for years. He was no longer an employee. No longer a partner. He was the owner. The refinery was his. And he would never share power again. He renamed the company Rockefeller and Andrews, bringing in his brother William and a chemist named Samuel Andrews who understood the science of refining better than anyone. Together, they transformed the operation. They built larger stills, recovered byproducts that other refineries threw away, and reinvested every dollar of profit back into expansion. While other refineries spent money on luxuries or paid out dividends, John kept his capital in the machine, making it stronger, faster, more ruthless. He worked 18-hour days, slept little, and never stopped calculating. At night, alone in his office, he would run his fingers over the ledgers, tracing the upward curve of his profits, and feel something close to peace. This was prayer. This was purpose. This was the hand of God, working through the language of numbers. And then, in 1870, he made the move that would change everything. He incorporated the Standard Oil Company, capitalized at $1 million, with himself as president. The name was deliberate. Not Rockefeller Oil. Not Superior Oil. But Standard. A promise. A guarantee. A declaration that his product would be the benchmark by which all others were measured. It was not arrogance. It was prophecy. Within 5 years, Standard Oil would control a quarter of the nation's refining capacity. Within 10, it would control nearly all of it. And the boy who once counted pennies in a wooden farmhouse would become the most powerful industrialist in the world, a man whose empire was so vast that even he could not see its edges. But that empire would not be built with luck. It would be built with strategy, discipline, and a willingness to do what others would not. To buy out competitors before they knew they were failing. To negotiate deals so complex that only he understood their full implications. To move silently, efficiently, and without mercy, until there was no one left to challenge him. The night deepened over Cleveland, and in a small office lit by a single lamp, John D. Rockefeller sat at his desk, staring at a map of the United States. He traced his finger along the rail lines, the rivers, the cities where oil refineries were beginning to multiply like weeds. And he made a decision. He would not compete with them. He would absorb them. One by one, quietly, methodically, until the entire industry answered to a single name. His name. It would take years. It would take sacrifice. But he had been preparing for this his entire life. And he was ready. There are moments in history when the world pivots on a single resource, when one substance becomes so essential that nations rise or fall based on their access to it. In the 1870s, that substance was oil. Not yet the fuel of automobiles or airplanes, those were still dreams sketched in notebooks, but the liquid that lit the darkness. Kerosene, refined from crude oil, was replacing whale oil and candles in homes across America and Europe. It was cleaner, brighter, and cheaper. And the man who controlled its production would control something far more valuable than money. He would control the night itself. John D. Rockefeller understood this with a clarity that bordered on religious conviction. While other men saw oil as a commodity to be bought and sold, he saw it as the foundation of an empire. But he also saw something else, something that separated him from the wildcatters and speculators who crowded the oil fields of Pennsylvania. He saw that the industry was sick. It was chaotic, inefficient, wasteful. Hundreds of small refineries competed against each other, driving prices down one month and up the next. Drillers pumped oil with no regard for supply or demand, flooding the market until crude sold for pennies a barrel. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Men who were millionaires on Monday were bankrupt by Friday. It was madness. And John D. Rockefeller believed that madness was a sin. He did not believe in competition the way other businessmen did. To him, competition was not a virtue but a disease. It led to waste, to duplication, to the squandering of resources that could be put to better use. What the oil industry needed, he believed, was not more players but fewer. What it needed was order. Consolidation. Control. And he was prepared to provide all three. Not through violence or coercion, at least not in the traditional sense, but through something far more elegant. Through economics. Through the quiet, patient application of pressure until his competitors had no choice but to surrender. His weapon was efficiency. Standard Oil refined petroleum more cheaply than anyone else in the country. John had studied every stage of the refining process, eliminating waste, recovering byproducts that other companies discarded, and negotiating deals with suppliers that gave him access to materials at prices his competitors could not match. He built his own barrel-making operations, cutting out the middlemen. He bought forests to supply the wood. He hired chemists to extract more kerosene from each barrel of crude. And most importantly, he secured secret agreements with the railroads that transported his oil. These railroad rebates were the key to everything. In the 1870s, if you wanted to ship oil from the refineries in Cleveland to the markets in New York, you had to use the railroads. And the railroads charged everyone the same rate, or at least, they were supposed to. But John negotiated a different arrangement. Standard Oil shipped so much oil, so consistently, that he could offer the railroads guaranteed volume. In exchange, they gave him rebates, secret discounts that lowered his shipping costs far below what his competitors paid. But it was more than that. In some cases, the railroads agreed to give Standard Oil a rebate not just on his own shipments, but on his competitors' shipments as well. Every time a rival refinery shipped a barrel of oil, a portion of the freight charge was quietly funneled back to Rockefeller. His competitors were, without knowing it, funding his war against them. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it was, at the time, perfectly legal. The deals were made in private, signed in quiet offices, and never spoken of in public. John did not boast about them. He did not need to. The results spoke for themselves. Standard Oil could sell kerosene at prices that other refineries could not match. And when those refineries began to struggle, when their profits thinned and their debts mounted, John would appear. Not with threats. Not with ultimatums. But with an offer. He would buy them out. He would pay a fair price, sometimes even a generous one. And in exchange, they would join Standard Oil, become part of something larger, something that could survive the chaos of the market. Many accepted. Those who refused found themselves trapped in a war they could not win, competing against a company that could always undercut their prices, always outlast their resources, always wait until they had no choice but to sell. By 1872, Standard Oil controlled nearly a quarter of the refining capacity in the United States. But John was not satisfied. A quarter was not enough. A quarter left room for competitors, for instability, for the return of chaos. He wanted something more complete. Something total. And so, he devised a plan so audacious, so controversial, that it would become one of the most infamous schemes in American business history. He called it the South Improvement Company. On paper, it was a collaboration between the largest refiners and the major railroads, designed to bring stability to the oil industry. In practice, it was a cartel. The South Improvement Company would control oil shipments, setting quotas for each refinery and dividing the market among its members. In exchange, the railroads would give massive rebates to members of the company and raise rates on everyone else. It would make competition impossible. Independent refiners would be crushed. And Standard Oil, as the largest member of the South Improvement Company, would emerge as the undisputed king of the oil industry. The plan was nearly perfect. Except for one thing. It leaked. Newspapers got hold of the details, and the public erupted in fury. The independent refiners, the drillers, the small towns that depended on the oil trade, they all saw the South Improvement Company for what it was. A monopoly in waiting. A plot to strangle competition and concentrate all power in the hands of a few men, with John D. Rockefeller at the center. Protests erupted in the oil regions. Effigies of Rockefeller were burned in the streets. Pennsylvania lawmakers launched investigations. And within months, the South Improvement Company was dead, its charter revoked, its ambitions dissolved in the acid of public outrage. But John D. Rockefeller was not discouraged. If anything, the failure taught him a lesson. The next time he built an empire, he would do it more quietly. More carefully. He would not announce his intentions. He would not rely on legislation or public agreements. He would simply buy. One refinery at a time. One competitor at a time. Until there was no one left to oppose him. And the world would wake up one morning to discover that the oil industry had a new master, and his name was written in every barrel, every lamp, every flicker of light that pushed back the darkness. In the winter of 1872, even as the South Improvement Company collapsed under the weight of public fury, John D. Rockefeller was already moving forward. He did not waste time on regret or recrimination. He had learned what he needed to learn. The world was not ready for open consolidation, for the honest declaration of monopoly. But it would accept the same outcome if it arrived quietly, dressed in the language of partnership and mutual benefit. And so, he began what would later be called the Cleveland Massacre, though no blood was spilled and no shots were fired. It was a massacre of balance sheets, of negotiations conducted in dim offices, of handshakes that felt like surrenders. Within 3 months, he approached nearly every refinery owner in Cleveland. He came with ledgers, with charts, with the calm, unshakable logic of a man who had already won. He showed them the numbers. Standard Oil's costs per barrel. Their costs per barrel. The gap was insurmountable. He explained, in his quiet, measured voice, that the future belonged to scale, to efficiency, to companies large enough to weather the storms that drowned smaller operations. He made offers. Some were generous. Others were less so. But all came with the same implicit understanding: you could join Standard Oil now, on favorable terms, or you could compete until bankruptcy forced you to sell for nothing. Most sold. 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries joined Standard Oil in those 3 months. Some owners wept as they signed the papers. Others left the meetings in silence, their faces blank, as if something inside them had been extinguished. A few tried to resist, to rally public support, to fight back through price wars and political pressure. But Rockefeller was patient. He could afford to lose money for months, even years, if it meant eliminating a rival. His competitors could not. And one by one, they fell. By the end of 1872, Standard Oil controlled virtually all of Cleveland's refining capacity. The city that had once been a chaotic marketplace of competing firms was now, effectively, a company town. And John D. Rockefeller was its quiet king. But Cleveland was just the beginning. The oil industry stretched across Pennsylvania, New York, and the growing cities of the Midwest. There were refineries in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in New York City itself. And John intended to own them all. Not through public declarations or dramatic takeovers, but through the same patient, methodical process he had perfected in Cleveland. He would approach each owner individually, study their finances, identify their weaknesses, and offer them a choice that was not really a choice at all. Join or die. Cooperate or be crushed. Most chose cooperation. Those who did not learn that Rockefeller's patience had limits, and his willingness to outlast them did not. He traveled constantly in those years, moving from city to city, meeting with refinery owners in their offices, in hotel rooms, sometimes in their own homes. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He simply presented the facts, the cold arithmetic of survival in an industry that was consolidating whether they liked it or not. And he always made one thing clear: Standard Oil was inevitable. You could be part of it, share in its success, enjoy its stability. Or you could stand outside and watch as the world changed without you. Most men, when faced with inevitability, chose survival. And so, the empire grew. By 1875, Standard Oil was refining more than half of the crude oil in the United States. By 1877, it was nearly 90%. 90%. The number was almost incomprehensible. It meant that nearly every drop of kerosene that lit American homes, that fueled European lamps, that pushed back the darkness in factories and streets and tenements, came from a company controlled by one man. John D. Rockefeller had not conquered the oil industry through violence or revolution. He had simply made it more efficient than anyone thought possible, and then used that efficiency as a weapon. His costs were lower. His distribution was faster. His operations were leaner. And because of this, he could always offer a better price, always outlast a rival, always wait until the market forced his competitors to come to him, hat in hand, asking to be absorbed into the machine. But the machine was not static. It was always evolving, always growing, always finding new ways to tighten its grip. Rockefeller did not just control refining. He began to control transportation. He bought pipelines that carried crude oil from the wells to the refineries, cutting out the middlemen who had once taken a share of every barrel. He bought tank cars that moved kerosene by rail, ensuring that his product traveled on his terms. He built storage facilities in every major city, guaranteeing that Standard Oil could supply markets faster and more reliably than any competitor. And he began to move downstream, establishing retail distribution networks that put Standard Oil kerosene directly into the hands of consumers, bypassing the wholesalers and merchants who had once controlled the final stage of the supply chain. It was vertical integration on a scale the world had never seen. From the moment crude oil came out of the ground to the moment a housewife lit her lamp, Standard Oil touched nearly every stage of the process. And at each stage, Rockefeller extracted value, eliminated waste, and reinforced his control. He was not building a company. He was building an ecosystem, a closed loop in which every part fed the whole and the whole grew stronger with each passing year. It was beautiful in its way, if beauty could be found in pure function, in the cold perfection of a machine designed to do one thing and do it better than anyone else ever could. And yet, for all his success, for all the wealth that was beginning to accumulate in ways that made even him uncomfortable, John D. Rockefeller did not live like a king. He still rose early, attended church every Sunday, taught Bible classes to young men, and gave 10% of his income to charity, just as his mother had taught him. He lived modestly, in a comfortable but unremarkable home, and rarely indulged in luxuries. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He did not gamble or carouse or chase the pleasures that other wealthy men found so irresistible. His only indulgence was the business itself, the endless, addictive challenge of making the machine more efficient, the empire more complete. He was, in his own mind, not a robber baron but a steward. God had given him a gift, the ability to see order where others saw chaos, and he believed it was his duty to use that gift, to bring stability and efficiency to an industry that desperately needed both. But the world was beginning to see him differently. Newspapers ran stories about the independent refiners who had been driven out of business, the towns that had withered after Standard Oil moved in, the men who had lost everything because they could not compete with Rockefeller's machine. Cartoons depicted him as an octopus, his tentacles wrapped around the oil industry, squeezing the life out of anyone who dared to resist. The word monopoly was whispered in Congress, in state legislatures, in editorial offices across the country. And though John dismissed much of it as ignorance, as the complaints of men who could not accept that the world had changed, a small part of him understood that something was shifting. That the empire he had built in shadow was beginning to draw the light. And light, as any student of history knew, could be as dangerous as any competitor. There is a peculiar loneliness that comes with absolute power. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being misunderstood, of seeing the world with such clarity that no one else can follow your gaze. John D. Rockefeller felt this loneliness often in the late 1870s and early 1880s, as his empire grew beyond anything the country had seen before. He believed, with the conviction of a prophet, that he was saving the oil industry from itself. That every refinery he absorbed, every competitor he eliminated, was an act of mercy, a necessary amputation to preserve the health of the whole. But the world did not see mercy. The world saw a monster, silent and methodical, consuming everything in its path. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled not just the refining of petroleum but the entire infrastructure that surrounded it. Rockefeller had built a network so complete, so interwoven, that to compete with him was to compete with gravity itself. He owned the pipelines that transported crude oil from the wells. He owned the refineries that turned it into kerosene. He owned the storage facilities in every major city. He owned the distribution networks that delivered the final product to retailers. And through his secret railroad agreements, he controlled the cost of moving oil across the continent. It was not a company. It was an ecosystem, and every creature within it answered to him. But the structure was fragile in one critical way. Standard Oil was still, legally, a collection of separate companies operating in different states. Rockefeller owned the majority shares in each, but they were not unified under a single corporate entity. This made the empire vulnerable to state laws, to the jealousies of local politicians, to the kind of regulatory meddling that could fracture the whole system. And so, in 1882, Rockefeller and his lawyers devised something revolutionary, something so ingenious that it would become both his greatest achievement and his ultimate undoing. They created the Standard Oil Trust. The trust was a legal invention, a way to hold multiple companies under a single organizational umbrella without technically merging them. Shareholders in the various Standard Oil companies would transfer their stock to a board of 9 trustees, led by Rockefeller himself. In exchange, they would receive trust certificates that entitled them to dividends but gave them no control over the company's operations. The trustees, and Rockefeller in particular, would make all decisions, coordinate all strategy, and control the entire empire from a single office in New York. It was brilliant. It was opaque. And it was, for a time, perfectly legal. With the trust in place, Rockefeller moved with even greater speed. He expanded into new markets, pushing Standard Oil kerosene into Europe, Asia, and South America. He built tankers to transport oil across oceans, refineries in foreign ports, distribution networks in countries that had never heard his name. The blue barrels of Standard Oil became a symbol recognized around the world, a promise of quality and reliability. And with each new market conquered, the empire grew richer, more powerful, more impossible to challenge. By 1885, Standard Oil was not just an American company. It was a global force, shaping economies, influencing governments, and controlling a resource that had become essential to modern life. But success bred resentment. The independent oil producers in Pennsylvania, the men who drilled the crude that Standard Oil refined, hated Rockefeller with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. They saw him as a parasite, feeding off their labor while paying them as little as possible for their oil. When crude prices fell to pennies a barrel, they blamed Rockefeller. When their wells ran dry and they faced bankruptcy, they blamed Rockefeller. And they were not entirely wrong. Standard Oil had enormous power to influence crude prices, to decide which producers thrived and which starved. Rockefeller used that power without apology. To him, it was simply the market at work, the natural result of efficiency and scale. But to the men in the oil fields, it felt like tyranny. In 1887, a group of independent producers banded together to build their own pipeline, a massive undertaking designed to break Standard Oil's stranglehold on transportation. They called it the Tidewater Pipeline, and it stretched more than 100 miles from the oil fields to the coast, bypassing the railroads that Rockefeller controlled. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that the oil industry could survive without him. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. Crude oil began flowing through the pipeline, prices stabilized, and the independents celebrated what they believed was the beginning of the end for Standard Oil's monopoly. But Rockefeller did not panic. He watched. He calculated. And then he acted. Standard Oil began buying shares in the Tidewater Pipeline, quietly, through intermediaries, until Rockefeller controlled enough stock to influence its decisions. He negotiated agreements with the pipeline's owners, offering them access to Standard Oil's distribution networks in exchange for cooperation. And when some of the independents tried to resist, he simply undercut their prices, flooding the market with cheap kerosene until they had no choice but to sell their crude to him at whatever price he offered. Within a few years, the Tidewater Pipeline was effectively part of the Standard Oil empire, another piece absorbed into the machine. The independents had fought. They had sacrificed. And they had lost. It was during these years that the myth of Rockefeller as an unstoppable force truly took hold. Businessmen spoke of him in whispers, as if saying his name too loudly might draw his attention. Competitors avoided eye contact when they passed him in the street. Journalists began to write not just about his wealth, but about the methods he used to acquire it, the secret deals, the cutthroat tactics, the quiet suffocation of rivals who stood in his way. And yet, for all the fear he inspired, there was also a grudging respect. Because whatever else he was, John D. Rockefeller was effective. He had taken an industry that was chaotic and wasteful and turned it into a model of efficiency. He had lowered the price of kerosene to levels that made it affordable for ordinary families. He had created thousands of jobs, built infrastructure that connected the country, and supplied a product that had become essential to modern life. He was a villain, yes. But he was also, in his way, a visionary. And he believed, with absolute certainty, that history would vindicate him. That one day, people would look back and see not a robber baron, but a builder. Not a monopolist, but a pioneer who had shown the world what was possible when efficiency and scale were pursued without compromise. He kept meticulous records, saved every letter, documented every decision, as if preparing his defense for a trial that had not yet begun. And every Sunday, he sat in church, singing hymns, praying for guidance, and giving thanks to a God he believed had chosen him for this work. The contradiction did not trouble him. In his mind, there was no contradiction. Wealth was a blessing. Power was a responsibility. And those who could not see this were simply too small to understand the larger plan. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes with believing yourself chosen. It is not ignorance, exactly, but something more subtle, a conviction so deep that it reshapes reality around itself, bending perception until every outcome seems like confirmation, every success like prophecy fulfilled. John D. Rockefeller lived inside this conviction. He saw his empire not as an act of conquest but as an act of salvation, a divine mission to bring order to chaos, efficiency to waste, light to darkness. And when people suffered because of his decisions, when small refiners went bankrupt or oil towns withered into dust, he did not see cruelty. He saw necessity. The painful but essential work of progress. He gave generously to charity, more than almost any man of his time. He funded churches, schools, hospitals. He paid the tuition of young men who wanted to study for the ministry. He donated thousands of dollars to the poor, to widows, to families struck by illness or misfortune. And he did it quietly, without fanfare, often anonymously. To him, this was not performance. It was duty. God had blessed him with wealth, and the Bible was clear about what wealth demanded: stewardship, generosity, care for those less fortunate. He tithed faithfully, giving 10% of everything he earned, just as his mother had taught him. And as his fortune grew into the millions, his giving grew with it, pouring out in rivers that touched lives across the country. But there was a paradox at the heart of his generosity, one that he could not quite resolve. The money he gave away came from an empire built on ruthlessness. The same hands that signed checks for orphanages also signed contracts that destroyed competitors. The same mind that calculated charitable donations also calculated how long a rival refinery could survive without access to favorable railroad rates. He saw no conflict in this. Business was business, governed by the laws of efficiency and competition. Charity was charity, governed by the laws of God and conscience. They were separate realms, and he moved between them with the ease of a man who believed he understood the boundaries of each. His employees saw a different side of him, one that confused them as much as it impressed them. He was demanding but fair, expecting absolute dedication but rewarding it with loyalty and security. He paid better wages than most companies, offered pensions and benefits that were rare in the 1880s. He did not tolerate drunkenness, laziness, or dishonesty, and those who violated his standards were dismissed immediately, without second chances. But those who worked hard, who shared his vision of efficiency and order, found in him a leader who remembered their names, who asked about their families, who noticed when they went beyond what was required. He was not warm, exactly. But he was present. And in an age when workers were often treated as interchangeable parts, that presence meant something. Yet even as he built this strange, contradictory empire, ruthless in competition, generous in charity, efficient in operation, the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. The newspapers that had once covered him with respectful distance were now circling closer, drawn by the scent of scandal and the public's growing appetite for stories about the men who had grown rich in America's Gilded Age. Reporters began investigating Standard Oil, digging into the secret railroad agreements, the crushed competitors, the towns that had lost their refineries and never recovered. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Not the truth as Rockefeller saw it, a story of progress and efficiency, but the truth as his victims saw it. A story of power wielded without mercy, of monopoly disguised as enterprise, of an empire built on the bones of men who had dared to compete. The most damaging revelations came from Pennsylvania, where the independent oil producers had been fighting Standard Oil for years. They testified before state legislatures, provided documents showing the preferential railroad rates, described in painful detail how they had been forced to sell their crude at prices that barely covered their costs while Standard Oil's profits soared. Some of these men had been wealthy once, had owned wells and land and futures bright with promise. Now they were bankrupt, broken, their dreams crushed beneath the weight of an organization so large it could absorb losses for years just to eliminate a single competitor. Their testimony was not calm or measured. It was raw with anger, with betrayal, with the kind of fury that comes from watching everything you built disappear into someone else's hands. And then there were the former employees, the men who had worked inside Standard Oil and seen how the machine operated. They spoke of the ruthless tactics, the deliberate campaigns to drive competitors into bankruptcy, the celebrations when a rival refinery finally closed its doors. They described meetings where Rockefeller and his inner circle plotted strategy like generals planning a siege, identifying weak points, allocating resources, deciding which companies to target next. Some of these accounts were exaggerated, distorted by bitterness or misunderstanding. But some were true. And even the true ones, when stripped of emotion and presented as simple fact, painted a picture that was difficult to defend. Rockefeller rarely responded to these attacks directly. He believed that engaging with critics only gave them legitimacy, that the best defense was simply to continue the work, to let results speak louder than words. Standard Oil kept growing, kept improving, kept lowering prices and expanding into new markets. The kerosene that lit homes across America was cheaper and more reliable than it had ever been. That, he believed, was the only answer that mattered. But he underestimated the power of narrative, the way a well-told story could shape public opinion more effectively than any ledger or price chart. And the story being told about him was not one of efficiency or progress. It was a story of greed, of a man who had accumulated so much power that he no longer answered to anyone, not to competitors, not to workers, not even to the laws that were supposed to govern commerce. In 1890, the state of Ohio took action. The Attorney General filed suit against Standard Oil, arguing that the trust was illegal, that it violated state laws against monopolies and restraint of trade. The case moved slowly through the courts, but the outcome was never really in doubt. In 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ordered the Standard Oil Trust to be dissolved. It was a stunning blow, a legal defeat that should have shattered the empire. But Rockefeller was not easily defeated. He had anticipated this possibility, had prepared contingencies, had lawyers working on solutions before the court had even issued its ruling. And so, instead of collapsing, the trust simply transformed. The companies that had been held by the trust were reorganized, their ownership structures altered, their connections made less visible but no less real. Rockefeller and his inner circle maintained control through interlocking directorates, through carefully coordinated policies, through the simple fact that they owned so much stock in each company that they could dictate decisions without needing a formal trust structure. To outside observers, it looked like compliance. In reality, almost nothing had changed. Standard Oil was still Standard Oil, still controlled by the same men, still pursuing the same strategies. The trust was dead in name only. The empire endured. But something else had changed, something harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Public opinion had turned. Rockefeller was no longer seen as a brilliant businessman but as a threat, a symbol of everything dangerous about unchecked corporate power. And across the country, in editorial offices and legislative chambers, in union halls and town squares, people were beginning to ask a question that would define the next 2 decades of American politics. How do you stop a man who has become more powerful than the law itself? The answer would not come easily. But it was coming. And John D. Rockefeller, for all his wealth and all his preparation, was not ready for what would follow. There are empires that fall suddenly, brought down by war or revolution, their collapse marked by fire and blood and the sound of walls crumbling. And then there are empires that fall slowly, eroded by time and scrutiny, by the patient work of people who refuse to accept that power, once gained, must remain forever. John D. Rockefeller's empire would fall the second way. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but across years of investigation, litigation, and the relentless pressure of a woman with a typewriter and a memory that would not let her forget. Her name was Ida Minerva Tarbell. She was born in 1857 in the oil regions of Pennsylvania, in a town called Hatch Hollow, where her father had built a small oil tank manufacturing business. She grew up watching the oil boom transform her world, seeing fortunes made and lost, watching men drill into the earth and pull up liquid gold. But she also watched what happened when Standard Oil arrived. She saw her father's business struggle as Rockefeller consolidated the industry. She saw neighbors who owned small refineries forced to sell or face ruin. She watched as the independent oil producers, the men who had built the industry with their own hands, were pushed aside by an organization so large and so efficient that resistance seemed futile. And she remembered. By the time she was in her 40s, Ida Tarbell had become one of the most respected journalists in America. She had written acclaimed biographies, traveled to Paris to study, and earned a reputation for meticulous research and clear, powerful prose. In 1900, she was approached by S.S. McClure, the publisher of McClure's magazine, with an assignment that would consume the next 2 years of her life. He wanted her to investigate Standard Oil. Not to write a polemic or a hatchet job, but to tell the full story, documented and factual, of how one man had come to control an entire industry. Ida accepted. And she brought to the work not just her skill as a journalist, but something more personal. She brought the memory of what Standard Oil had done to her father, to her town, to the dream of independent enterprise that had once defined the oil fields of Pennsylvania. She spent months in archives, reading court documents, railroad records, testimony from congressional hearings. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees who spoke on condition of anonymity, their voices still trembling with the fear of what Rockefeller's organization might do if they were identified. She tracked down the independent oil producers who had fought and lost, men who were now old and broken, living on the edges of the industry they had helped create. And slowly, methodically, she assembled a picture of Standard Oil that no one had seen before. Not just the surface story of efficiency and growth, but the machinery beneath, the secret railroad rebates, the espionage, the deliberate campaigns to crush competitors, the legal maneuvers that allowed Rockefeller to evade state laws and operate as a monopoly in everything but name. In November 1902, the first installment of The History of the Standard Oil Company appeared in McClure's magazine. It was 19 installments in total, running over 2 years, and it was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Ida did not shout. She did not editorialize or exaggerate. She simply presented the facts, one after another, in prose so clear and so damning that readers could not look away. She described how Rockefeller had used the South Improvement Company to try to cartelize the industry. She detailed the Cleveland Massacre, the systematic absorption of competitors. She showed how the railroad rebates worked, how Standard Oil received kickbacks not just on its own shipments but on the shipments of its rivals. She told the stories of men who had been forced out of business, of towns that had withered when their refineries closed, of an industry that had been transformed from competitive chaos into something that resembled a dictatorship, with one man at the center of it all. The series exploded across the country. It was read by millions, discussed in parlors and newspapers and the halls of Congress. People who had never thought much about the oil industry suddenly understood what monopoly looked like, what it meant when one company controlled not just a product but the entire infrastructure that surrounded it. Ida Tarbell had done something remarkable. She had taken a subject that could have been dry and technical and turned it into a story that felt personal, urgent, moral. And at the center of that story was John D. Rockefeller, no longer the brilliant businessman or the generous philanthropist, but something darker. A man who had built an empire on ruthlessness and called it progress. A man who believed himself chosen by God even as he crushed anyone who stood in his way. Rockefeller read the articles. He said little publicly, maintaining the silence that had served him so well over the years. But privately, he was furious. Not just because of the damage to his reputation, but because he believed Tarbell had misunderstood everything. She had looked at his empire and seen only cruelty, only monopoly, only power exercised without restraint. She had not seen the order he had brought to chaos, the efficiency that had lowered prices and made kerosene available to millions. She had not understood that competition, in his view, was wasteful and destructive, that consolidation was not theft but evolution, the natural progression of industry toward its most efficient form. He believed history would vindicate him. But he was beginning to realize that history was being written by people like Ida Tarbell, and their version of the story was not kind. The public outcry that followed the series gave new energy to the political movement that had been building for years. Trust busting, they called it, the effort to break up the massive corporations that had come to dominate American industry. Standard Oil was not the only target. There were trusts in steel, in sugar, in railroads, and banking. But Standard Oil was the largest, the most visible, and thanks to Ida Tarbell, the best documented. It became the symbol of everything Americans feared about concentrated corporate power, about an economy where a few men could control the resources that everyone else depended on. And in 1901, the presidency passed to a man who was more than willing to take on that fight. Theodore Roosevelt was young, energetic, and unafraid of powerful men. He believed deeply in capitalism, in the free market, in the idea that competition made America strong. But he also believed that monopolies were a betrayal of that system, that they destroyed competition and concentrated power in ways that were fundamentally un-American. He called them malefactors of great wealth, and he made it clear that his administration would use every tool at its disposal to break them apart. And Standard Oil, the biggest trust of them all, was at the top of his list. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law passed in 1890 that made it illegal to monopolize trade or commerce. The case was assigned to Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a man known for his distrust of corporate power and his willingness to challenge even the most powerful defendants. The trial would take years, would generate thousands of pages of testimony, would become one of the most closely watched legal battles in American history. And at its center was a question that had never been fully answered: was efficiency a crime? Could a company be punished for being too successful, for driving out competitors not through violence or fraud, but simply by being better at what it did? Rockefeller's lawyers argued that Standard Oil had done nothing illegal. They pointed to the lower prices that consumers enjoyed, to the jobs the company had created, to the infrastructure it had built. They argued that the Sherman Act was meant to prevent conspiracies to restrain trade, not to punish companies that succeeded through innovation and efficiency. Standard Oil had grown large because it was good at what it did, because it had invested in technology and logistics and management in ways that competitors had not. To break it up, they argued, would be to punish success, to tell American businesses that excellence was dangerous, that growing too large or too efficient would make you a target of the government. The government's lawyers told a different story. They argued that Standard Oil had not succeeded through fair competition but through coercion and manipulation. They presented the evidence that Ida Tarbell had uncovered and more, documents showing how Standard Oil had pressured railroads to deny service to competitors, how it had used industrial espionage to steal trade secrets, how it had deliberately flooded local markets with cheap kerosene to bankrupt rivals and then raised prices once the competition was gone. They called witnesses who testified about being forced to sell their businesses, about receiving offers they could not refuse, about watching their life's work absorbed into an organization that gave them no choice but to comply. This was not efficiency, the prosecutors argued. This was monopoly. And monopoly was exactly what the Sherman Act had been designed to prevent. The trial dragged on. Testimony was taken in cities across the country. Mountains of documents were submitted as evidence. Rockefeller himself was called to testify, and he appeared in court looking older than his 70 years, his face lined with tension, his once sharp eyes clouded with exhaustion. He answered questions carefully, precisely, often claiming not to remember details of transactions that had taken place decades earlier. His performance was criticized in the press as evasive, though his lawyers insisted he was simply being truthful. After all, how could anyone remember the specifics of every business decision made over 40 years? But the image that emerged was not flattering. Here was the richest man in the world, the architect of the largest corporate empire ever built, sitting in a witness chair and claiming ignorance of how his own company operated. In 1909, the federal court ruled against Standard Oil. The decision was sweeping and unambiguous. The court found that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Act, that it had engaged in practices designed to eliminate competition and maintain monopoly power. The company was ordered to be dissolved, broken into its constituent parts, with each part operating as an independent entity. It was a complete victory for the government, a vindication of the trust-busting movement, and a devastating blow to Rockefeller's empire. But the fight was not over. Standard Oil immediately appealed to the Supreme Court, and for 2 more years, the fate of the empire hung in balance. During those years, Rockefeller withdrew further from public life. He had already stepped back from the day-to-day management of Standard Oil years earlier, turning control over to younger executives. Now he retreated to his estates, spending time with his family, playing golf, attending church, and trying to find peace in a world that had turned against him. He was not broke, far from it. Even if Standard Oil was dissolved, he owned shares in all of its component parts, and those shares would still generate enormous wealth. But the empire he had built, the unified machine that had been his life's work, was coming apart. And though he maintained his public composure, though he never admitted regret or acknowledged wrongdoing, those close to him could see the toll it was taking. He slept poorly. His stomach troubles, which had plagued him for years, grew worse. And in quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, his face would settle into an expression that looked almost like grief. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court issued its decision. By a vote of 8-1, the justices upheld the lower court's ruling. Standard Oil was a monopoly, had engaged in illegal practices to maintain that monopoly, and must be broken apart. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White wrote that while the Sherman Act did not outlaw all restraints of trade, it absolutely prohibited those that were unreasonable, and Standard Oil's practices, he concluded, were unreasonable in every sense. The company had 30 days to submit a plan for dissolution. The empire that had taken 40 years to build would be dismantled in months. The breakup created 34 separate companies, each operating independently in different regions or focusing on different aspects of the oil business. There was Standard Oil of New Jersey, which would eventually become Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil. Standard Oil of California, which became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana, which became Amoco. And dozens more, each carrying a piece of the empire forward into a new era. The Supreme Court believed it was restoring competition, creating a marketplace where multiple companies would fight for customers and innovation would flourish. And in some ways, it succeeded. The oil industry did become more competitive, did see new players emerge, did evolve in ways that might not have been possible under the shadow of a single dominant firm. But something strange happened that no one had predicted. When the 34 companies began operating independently, investors realized that each piece of Standard Oil was valuable on its own. Without the overhead of coordinating with the other pieces, without the need to subsidize weaker divisions, each company could focus on its strengths and maximize its efficiency. And so, the stock prices rose. All of them. Every single one of the 34 companies saw its shares increase in value as the market recognized the potential of these newly independent entities. And John D. Rockefeller, who owned shares in all of them, watched as his wealth multiplied beyond even his own expectations. It was the final irony of his empire. The government had broken Standard Oil apart to punish monopoly and restore competition. Instead, it had made Rockefeller richer than he had ever been. By 1913, his fortune was estimated at nearly $900 million, roughly equivalent to $400 billion in today's currency. He was the world's first billionaire, a man whose wealth surpassed that of many nations, whose name had become synonymous with power and excess and the strange contradictions of American capitalism. He had been defeated. His empire had been dismantled. And yet, in the arithmetic of wealth, he had won more completely than anyone could have imagined. The machine was gone. But the fortune it had generated would outlive him, would shape the world for generations, would become the foundation of a philanthropic legacy that would try, in its own way, to answer the question that had haunted him all along: what do you do with power that great? How do you use it? And who, in the end, gets to decide? There is a particular kind of silence that comes after battle, when the fighting is over and the dust has settled, and all that remains is to count the cost and decide what the victory means. John D. Rockefeller entered this silence in 1911, at the age of 72, watching his empire fracture into pieces while his fortune grew larger than any human being had ever possessed. The newspapers still wrote about him, but the tone had changed. He was no longer the villain they needed to expose. He was something stranger now, a relic, a monument, a living reminder of an era that America was trying to leave behind. And in this unexpected quiet, he began the second great work of his life. Not the accumulation of wealth, but its distribution. Not the building of an empire, but the building of a legacy that might redeem, or at least complicate, the memory of how that empire was made. He had always given to charity. From his very first paycheck as a teenage bookkeeper, he had tithed 10% to his church, just as his mother had taught him. As his fortune grew, so did his giving, thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing out to churches, schools, hospitals, individuals in need. But it was scattered, unsystematic, driven by personal connections and requests that arrived daily by the hundreds. People wrote to him asking for help with medical bills, with tuition, with business ventures that had failed. Some letters were genuine. Many were not. And Rockefeller, who had built his empire on efficiency and order, began to realize that his philanthropy needed the same rigor he had once applied to refining oil. Random acts of charity, however well-intentioned, were not enough. If he was going to give away a fortune this vast, he needed a strategy. In 1889, he met a man who would help him find that strategy. Frederick Taylor Gates was a Baptist minister, smart and ambitious, with a mind that understood both theology and business. Rockefeller hired him initially to advise on charitable donations, but Gates quickly became something more, a partner, a visionary, the architect of a new kind of philanthropy. Gates believed that charity should not simply alleviate suffering but address its root causes. Instead of giving food to the hungry, you should invest in agriculture that would prevent hunger. Instead of treating the sick, you should fund research that would eliminate disease. It was philanthropy as engineering, as problem-solving on a massive scale. And it appealed to everything in Rockefeller's nature, the love of efficiency, the belief in systems, the conviction that with enough thought and planning, even the largest problems could be solved. Together, they began to transform American philanthropy. In 1901, Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the first institution in America dedicated solely to understanding disease at the cellular and molecular level. He gave it an endowment of millions and told the scientists to pursue whatever research seemed most promising, without worrying about immediate practical applications. It was a radical idea, that basic science, curiosity-driven and long-term, could be more valuable than the immediate development of treatments and cures. And it worked. The institute attracted some of the brightest minds in medicine, made discoveries that transformed the understanding of infectious disease, and laid the groundwork for breakthroughs that would save millions of lives over the coming decades. But medical research was just the beginning. Rockefeller looked at the problems facing America and the world and decided to attack them with the same systematic approach he had once used to dominate the oil industry. Education was one of his primary targets. In the South, African Americans were emerging from slavery into a world that denied them access to schools, to books, to the tools they needed to build better lives. Rockefeller funded the creation of schools and colleges specifically for black students, pouring millions into institutions that would become pillars of African American education. He funded Spelman College in Atlanta, named after his wife's family, making it one of the premier schools for black women in the country. He supported the work of Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute, believing in Washington's philosophy of industrial education and economic self-sufficiency. It was complicated philanthropy, tangled with the racial politics and assumptions of the early 20th century. Rockefeller believed he was helping, believed he was using his wealth to create opportunity where none existed. And in many ways, he was. The schools he funded educated thousands of students who otherwise would have had no access to higher learning. But his philanthropy also reflected the paternalism of his time, the belief that wealthy white men knew best how to solve the problems facing black communities, that uplift should come from above rather than from within. It was generosity, yes. But it was generosity that never quite questioned the structures of power that had created the inequality in the first place. Still, the scale of his giving was unprecedented. In 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, a massive philanthropic organization with a mission so broad it seemed almost absurd, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The foundation received an initial endowment of over $100 million, making it the largest charitable organization in history. And it set to work immediately, funding public health campaigns, supporting scientific research, building libraries and hospitals, working to eradicate diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. The foundation's work in combating hookworm in the American South alone reached millions of people, treating a parasitic disease that had sapped the energy and productivity of entire communities. It was not glamorous work. But it was effective. And effectiveness, in Rockefeller's view, was the highest virtue. As the foundation grew, so did its ambitions. Rockefeller's money funded expeditions to study tropical diseases, supported agricultural research that would lead to the Green Revolution, helped establish public health systems in countries around the world. The foundation worked in China, in India, in Africa and South America, places where Rockefeller himself would never visit but where his wealth could reach farther than any empire. And slowly, the narrative around him began to shift. He was still the man who had built Standard Oil, still the robber baron who had crushed competitors and bent industries to his will. But he was also something else now. A philanthropist. A benefactor. A man who had used the same ruthless efficiency to give away a fortune that he had once used to build it. But there was another dimension to his giving, one that was quieter and more personal. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, preserving a piece of American history that might otherwise have crumbled into dust. He supported the arts, the sciences, the kinds of cultural institutions that made civilization richer and more humane. And he gave directly to individuals, students who needed tuition, families struck by tragedy, ministers struggling to keep their churches afloat. He read letters from strangers asking for help, and though he could not respond to all of them, he responded to more than most people knew. There was something almost touching about it, this billionaire sitting in his study, reading pleas for $100 or $1,000, deciding which ones were genuine and which were not, signing checks that meant nothing to his vast wealth but everything to the people who received them. The years passed gently for John D. Rockefeller, softer than the decades that had come before. He divided his time between his estates, Kykuit, the grand house overlooking the Hudson River in Pocantico Hills, and his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida, where the air was warm and the ocean stretched endlessly toward horizons he would never reach. He played golf obsessively, a game he had taken up late in life but approached with the same discipline he had once brought to refining oil. He counted his strokes meticulously, played the same courses over and over, always seeking improvement, always measuring progress. It was competition distilled to its purest form, just a man, a ball, and the distance between where you were and where you wanted to be. His health, which had troubled him for decades, improved in these later years. The stomach ailments that had plagued him since middle age eased. The stress that had hollowed him out during the trust-busting years lifted. He gained weight, looked healthier, and his doctors marveled at his resilience. He credited his longevity to simple living, regular hours, moderate eating, no alcohol or tobacco, and a faith that never wavered. Every morning, he woke early, read his Bible, and prayed. Every Sunday, he attended church, sang hymns in a voice that had grown thin but remained steady, and listened to sermons that reminded him that wealth was temporary, that only the soul endured, that the treasures of earth were nothing compared to the treasures of heaven. He believed this. And yet, he also believed that earthly treasures, properly used, could serve heavenly purposes. It was a theology of stewardship, of responsibility, of the idea that God gave wealth to those who would use it wisely. And he intended to prove himself worthy of the trust. His family life, which had always been intensely private, became his refuge. His wife, Laura Celestia Spellman Rockefeller, whom everyone called SETI, had been his partner for more than 50 years. She was quiet, devout, practical, the steady hand that had kept their household running while he built his empire. She shared his faith, his commitment to charity, his belief in discipline and hard work. And when she died in 1915, something inside him broke that never fully healed. He had faced critics, lawsuits, public hatred, the dissolution of his empire. But losing SETI felt different. It was personal in a way that business never was, a wound that wealth could not touch and philanthropy could not soothe. He grieved quietly, as was his nature, and poured himself even more deeply into the work of giving, as if by helping others he might fill the space she had left behind. He had 4 children who survived to adulthood, and his relationship with them was complex, layered with expectations and love and the strange burden of being raised by the richest man in the world. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., became the primary steward of the family fortune, taking on the work of managing the foundations, the investments, the endless decisions about where and how to give. Junior, as he was called, was nothing like his father. He lacked the ruthless edge, the willingness to crush competitors, the cold arithmetic that had built Standard Oil. But he had something else, a genuine commitment to social justice, to labor rights, to using the family wealth in ways that addressed inequality rather than simply alleviating its symptoms. He funded the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York, helped save the United Nations by donating the land for its headquarters, and supported causes that his father might have found too radical. And Senior, watching his son work, felt something he had not expected. Pride. Not because Junior was building an empire, but because he was building something that might last longer than empires. A legacy of generosity that could outlive them both. But the question that haunted Rockefeller in his final years was one he could never quite answer: could you atone for how you made your fortune by giving it away? Could philanthropy redeem a life built on monopoly? The public seemed divided. Some saw his charitable work as genuine, as evidence that he had changed, that age and faith had softened the man who had once been so ruthless. Others saw it as a calculated effort to rehabilitate his reputation, to buy back the goodwill that his business practices had destroyed. The truth, as it often does, lived somewhere in between. He was not cynical about his giving, his faith was too real, his commitment too deep, for it to be pure performance. But he was also not naive. He knew that philanthropy changed how people saw him, that every school built and every disease cured added weight to the other side of the scale, balancing, if not erasing, the memory of crushed competitors and broken industries. In his 90s, Rockefeller became a kind of national curiosity, one of the last survivors of the Gilded Age, an era that now seemed impossibly distant. The world had changed. The First World War had come and gone, reshaping nations and breaking empires. The companies that had emerged from Standard Oil's breakup were thriving, adapting to a world where automobiles were replacing kerosene lamps, where oil was no longer just for lighting but for transportation, for industry, for war. He watched these changes from a distance, no longer involved in the day-to-day decisions, but always aware, always calculating in the back of his mind how things might have been different if the empire had stayed whole. He gave interviews occasionally, carefully managed by his staff, and reporters marveled at his lucidity, his sharp memory, his ability to recall details from decades earlier. But there was also something melancholy about him, a sense that he was aware of how history would remember him, and that the memory was not entirely fair but also not entirely wrong. He gave away more than $500 million in his lifetime, an amount that would be worth tens of billions today. He funded universities that educated millions, medical research that saved countless lives, public health campaigns that eradicated diseases, cultural institutions that enriched the world in ways that could not be measured in dollars. It was philanthropy on a scale that had never been attempted before, and it established a model that other wealthy men would follow: Carnegie, Mellon, Ford, and eventually Gates and Buffett in the modern era. The idea that great wealth carried great responsibility, that those who accumulated fortunes had an obligation to give them back, became embedded in American culture in large part because of what John D. Rockefeller did in the last decades of his life. But he never escaped the shadow of how he made that fortune. The investigations, the lawsuits, Ida Tarbell's devastating articles, these remained part of his story, impossible to erase or ignore. He was a contradiction that could not be resolved, a man who embodied both the promise and the danger of American capitalism. He had shown what could be achieved through efficiency, innovation, and relentless focus. But he had also shown what happened when power concentrated in too few hands, when competition was eliminated, when one man's vision became an entire industry's reality. And America, having watched his rise and his fall, had to decide what lessons to take from both. On May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old, had lived through the Civil War and the First World War and the beginning of the Second, had seen the country transform from a nation of farms and small towns into an industrial superpower. His funeral was simple, in keeping with his Baptist faith, no grand monuments, no elaborate ceremonies, just family and close friends gathered to say goodbye. He was buried next to SETI in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, the city where his empire had begun, where he had once walked door to door looking for work, where he had learned that the world did not care about dreams but only about what you could count, what you could prove, what you could build. The will he left behind was as precise as everything else he had ever done. Every dollar accounted for, every asset catalogued, every distribution carefully planned. Most of his wealth had already been given away through the foundations and trusts he had established. What remained went to his children and grandchildren, but even that came with conditions, with expectations, with the understanding that being a Rockefeller meant more than simply inheriting money. It meant carrying forward the work, the responsibility, the strange bargain he had made with himself in those final decades, that wealth could be redeemed through how it was used, that power could be justified if it served something larger than itself. In the days after his death, newspapers across the country ran obituaries that struggled to summarize a life so large and so contradictory. Some called him the greatest businessman who ever lived, a visionary who had transformed an industry and shown what American capitalism could achieve. Others called him a robber baron, a monopolist who had crushed competitors and bent the rules until they served only him. Both were true. Both missed something essential. Because John D. Rockefeller was not simply a businessman or a villain or a philanthropist. He was a mirror, reflecting back the values and contradictions of the society that made him possible. He succeeded because America rewarded efficiency and scale. He was broken apart because America feared concentrated power. And he was remembered with ambivalence because the country itself was ambivalent about what his life meant. The foundations he created outlived him by decades, by generations, continuing the work of funding research and education and public health long after his name had faded from daily conversation. The Rockefeller Foundation supported the development of a yellow fever vaccine that saved millions of lives. It funded the Green Revolution, the agricultural research that helped feed a growing world population. It established public health systems in countries where such systems had never existed. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research became Rockefeller University, a center of scientific excellence that produced Nobel Prize winners and breakthroughs that changed medicine. The universities he funded educated generations of students who would never know his name but whose lives were shaped by his money. And the companies that emerged from Standard Oil's breakup, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and dozens more, became giants in their own right, shaping the 20th century as profoundly as their parent company had shaped the 19th. They powered 2 world wars, fueled the economic boom of the post-war years, and became so essential to modern life that it was almost impossible to imagine a world without them. The irony was not lost on historians. The government had broken up Standard Oil to restore competition, but the pieces it created became, in many ways, as powerful as the original had ever been. Rockefeller's vision of a world organized around oil, of an industry so efficient and so integrated that it touched every aspect of modern life, had been realized even in the empire's destruction. But what about the man himself? What do we say about John D. Rockefeller now, more than a century after his death, when the world he made has transformed again into something he could never have imagined? He lived in a time when monopoly was possible, when one person could accumulate power on a scale that frightened governments. We live in a time when such accumulation is both easier and more scrutinized, when billionaires arise and fall with strange rapidity, when wealth concentrates in ways that echo the Gilded Age but operate through different mechanisms, technology instead of oil, data instead of steel, algorithms instead of railroads. And the questions his life raised remain unanswered. How much power should one person have? What obligations come with great wealth? Can you build something through ruthless means and still claim it serves a greater good? Rockefeller believed the answer was yes. He believed that efficiency justified almost any method, that the end result, cheaper kerosene, better infrastructure, a world lit by lamps that ordinary people could afford, mattered more than the competitors crushed along the way. He believed that wealth was a divine trust, that God had given him the ability to accumulate and the responsibility to distribute, and that both were equally sacred. And he lived that belief with a consistency that was almost frightening, never wavering, never doubting, never apologizing for choices that others saw as cruel but he saw as necessary. But there was something else in his story, something quieter and harder to define. In the final years of his life, when reporters asked him if he had any regrets, he would pause, his eyes distant, and say that he wished he had started giving away his money earlier. Not because he needed the redemption, he never quite admitted needing that, but because he had discovered that giving brought a different kind of satisfaction than building ever had. There was a joy in seeing a school opened, a disease eradicated, a young person's life changed by an opportunity they would never have had without help. It was not the cold satisfaction of efficiency or the thrill of victory over a competitor. It was something warmer, something that felt, in his words, like the closest thing to grace he had ever experienced. And so we are left with a man who contained multitudes. The boy who counted pennies in a wooden farmhouse. The young businessman who walked Cleveland streets looking for work. The empire builder who saw chaos and demanded order. The monopolist who believed competition was wasteful. The philanthropist who gave away a fortune larger than most nations. The husband who mourned his wife. The father who watched his son transform the family legacy. The believer who never doubted that God had chosen him for the work he did. He was all of these, and none of them fully explain him. History has tried to reduce him to a single story, hero or villain, visionary or monster, but he slips through every attempt at definition, remaining always just slightly out of reach, just beyond the categories we use to make sense of the past. The night he died, the lamps in his room burned kerosene refined from oil that had traveled through systems he helped create. Outside, cars powered by gasoline, another product of the industry he built, moved through streets lit by electricity that was replacing the kerosene lamps his empire had once made essential. The world was changing again, moving beyond him, and would continue to change in ways that made his empire seem almost quaint, a relic of a simpler time when power was measured in barrels and railroads rather than gigabytes and satellites. But the questions he embodied, about wealth, about power, about the price of progress and who pays it, these remained. And they remain still. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of this story settle like dust after a long journey. Picture a man at the end of his life, looking back across nearly a century, seeing the empire he built and the wreckage it left behind, the lives he changed and the lives he crushed, the wealth he accumulated and the wealth he gave away. Picture him asking himself, in the quiet moments before sleep, whether it was worth it. Whether the light his oil provided justified the darkness of how it was obtained. Whether God, in whom he believed so completely, saw him as he saw himself, a steward, faithful and true, or as something more complicated, more human, more flawed. He never answered that question aloud. Perhaps he never answered it even to himself. But the question echoes through time, carried forward by everyone who builds something large, who accumulates something vast, who believes that their vision justifies the cost. And in the silence that follows, in the space between what we achieve and what we sacrifice to achieve it, we hear not an answer but a whisper. A reminder that empires rise and fall, that fortunes are made and given away, that names once feared become footnotes, and that in the end, what remains is not the size of what we built but whether it made the world, this strange, broken, beautiful world, a little bit better than we found it. Rest now. Let the story fade like lamplight at dawn. And know that somewhere in the archives, in the foundations that still bear his name, in the schools and hospitals and research centers funded by wealth earned a century ago, the work continues. Not because John D. Rockefeller was perfect, but because even imperfect men, even those who build empires on ruthlessness and call it progress, can leave behind something that outlasts their mistakes. Something that whispers, across the years, that redemption is possible. That change is possible. That the story is never finished, not really, as long as someone remembers and someone learns and someone decides to do better. Good night.